In this section, we're going to be talking about aquatic and marine organisms. And as we go through these sections, make sure that you really keep in mind the abiotic and the biotic factors that affect the different ecosystems. So when we talk about water, one of the important things is to remember how far light can go down into the water because it doesn't go down and penetrate indefinitely. And then also remember that because the light from the sun can't go through, indefinitely, also the heat energy from the sun is also not indefinite. So there's going to be different levels of water that get warmed different ways, and it's not mixed perfectly like you would expect. I'm a scuba diver, and a lot of divers know this, maybe even some snorkelers that are good at like free diving and going really deep in the water. But when you go in places like deep lakes or in the open ocean, you do end up swimming through different parts called thermoclines. And this picture is not showing thermoclines, but it's showing different depths of the ocean. However, you can almost look at a thermocline in the same way that you'll be swimming along, and then all of a sudden there is a distinct layer where you can be dropping down as a scuba diver, and half of your body is in a much cooler, I mean, it can be 10 to 15 degrees or more difference, that half of your body will be cooler and half will be warmer. And you would think like it's impossible for those layers to not mix, but because they have different densities, they hold different amounts of salt, they actually don't mix. And so it's called a thermocline, and you can distinctly feel it as you drop down into the ocean. It's a really interesting phenomenon. So in marine biomes, especially in the open ocean, there's different places. One area is called the intertidal zone. This is where the tide comes up and down. Like maybe when you set up on the beach at the beginning, you're right near the waves, but then you have to move back further up on the beach as the tide comes up. That's called the intertidal zone. And then here is the neritic zone. That's where it's like the top of where the waves are coming up until there's a drop off. And then the oceanic zone just extends all the way deep in the ocean. The photic zone is how deep light can get. The benthic zone is along the bottom of the ocean. So in some places it's not that deep. Some places it is very deep. And then you can also have different like thermal vents. The thermal vent area, because it's also in the aphotic zone, so this whole area on this drawing is called the aphotic zone. That means no light zone. So the creatures down here are not relying on light for their energy. And I actually brought up some of the aphotic zone. There's not a lot of great photography because it's very deep in the ocean and there's no light. But a lot of the creatures there can make their own light, but they're relying on dead and decaying matter that are falling from up above for a lot of their energy. And also they are they rely on the chemicals that come out of the hydrothermal vents for their food. So I think that's all. This is in your book. This is called the abyssal zone. There's a few different names for all of these. So we're gonna move to the place of your nightmares to the place of your dreams. Okay, so here's coral reefs. Coral reefs are gorgeous, and they're very colorful. We have some here in the United States, but no place really is much better than the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and that's where I got to study. And here you have different animals that actually depend on the reef quite a bit. One of them are called, well, generally, broadly, are different animals that actually eat the coral called corallivores. And there's all different species of fish that actually eat the coral, and they go and they kind of nibble on it a little bit, and they are called corallivores. They don't generally over harvest. This is one that's really bad called the crown of thorns starfish. This is an invasive creature that actually does well. Like almost the more the coral reef dies, the more it takes off and kills more of the coral reef. So it's one of those animals that's really bad. But the coral reefs are actually naturally clear. Their skeleton is kind of a white, opaque, clear color. And the way that they get their color is actually from the zooxanthellae. So zooxanthellae are a type of plankton, and they actually kind of act like a plant and sort of like an animal in that they photosynthesize and use sunlight, but they actually respirate sort of like an animal, and they make lots of extra energy. And coral is actually an animal that over millions of years, they have a hard skeleton, and they will house some of these zooxanthellae. So it's actually the zooxanthellae that give the coral the color. So whatever color zooxanthellae are living in that coral, that's what color that coral will be. And the zooxanthellae actually for that rent, they're like living inside of the coral. For that rent and protection, they actually feed the coral. So coral is actually incapable of making enough food for itself. It'll make maybe 50 to 70, maybe 80% of its food for itself, but that's not enough. And it would otherwise die without the zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae is a symbiotic relationship. It gives the coral food, and then the coral gives the zooxanthellae a place to live. Well, as the zooxanthellae are exposed to too much sun, as we break down the ozone and things like that, we can have, there's actually been holes over Australia where they're receiving too much sunlight. The zooxanthellae will actually start overproducing food, but it'll also start overproducing waste, and that makes the coral kind of sick. So the coral eventually gives up, and it expels the zooxanthellae. It's like, get out, you're making all this waste, go, you're a bad renter, and it kicks it out. At that point, because it has lost its colorful creature inside, the coral is said to be bleached. It no longer has its color because the zooxanthellae was creating too much waste. It was killing the coral, so the coral kicked it out. But now the coral is in a situation where it's bleached, it doesn't have color, but it also cannot create enough food for itself. So it slowly starts maybe a 2 week to a month or so time period where it is slowly starving to death. And once it has starved to death, it will turn to coral rubble and break down very quickly and look like this. So interestingly, as you go through the reef and see it, this is very bleached coral. This is dead coral. And you'll see these patches of yellow coral, and here's like a picture trying to show it. Very bright yellow coral is indicative of coral that is highly stressed and about to die. If it doesn't get help very quickly, it will die. And so when you see these bright fluorescent yellow corals, this white has just expelled. These are dead, and this one is highly stressed. So here's different pictures of that, and you can look it up, but we really do need to protect the reef, and there's great people out there trying to replant it and trying to take good information. If you ever want to follow on social media a great organization, this is through the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. This is who I got to partner with. They are Reef HQ. They have the largest reef tanks in the world, and they are regrowing coral, and then they go out and replant coral plugs as fast as they can. But the Great Barrier Reef is like massive, like I think the size of Texas or something. You could look that up, but it's just huge. So it's hard for humans to just manage the whole thing. It would be better if we just did things that didn't disturb the environment so much to begin with. So coral reefs are important places. Not when the coral dies, the sad part is that then the bigger things start to die. Then the fish that depend on the coral start to die. Then whales and things like that use that as a birthing ground, they start to die. So it's very important that that gets protected. Okay, so estuaries are areas where the ocean meets freshwater. So it's this transition zone between freshwater rivers and like a saltwater ocean. And you need to have species that live there that can really handle salt and freshwater conditions and changing fresh and saltwater conditions. Because when it's like low tide and the saltwater's out, then it's going to be more freshwater. As the tide comes in a few times a day, it's going to have a surge of salty water. So it actually is a difficult transition place to live, but there are, of course, creatures that take that are adapted to everything. One of my favorites there is mangrove trees. Mangrove trees are highly adapted to not taking in much salt through their roots, and they live really up and above the water and have this cool life down there right in estuaries. And there's pictures of them a long time ago, well, for many years, adapting, but it was thought for a long time that the older leaves on mangrove trees actually, that the mangrove tree would push all of its salt to a certain leaf, an older leaf, and then that leaf would fall off, and then kind of almost like the sacrificial leaf concept. But it looks like it's being studied further, and they're finding that that's not really the case. And so it's interesting, one of those things where the science is changing. So if you've ever heard that sacrificial leaf concept with mangroves, just know that scientists are studying that and not finding a real change in that. So that would be an interesting thing to watch as we go along. So freshwater biomes are those that, let me go back to the book because I have moved along and not kept you up on the book here. But different freshwater biomes can be really small, from a few meters to massively huge. And temperature really makes a big difference in these spaces, because if it can get really hot, almost so hot that it will cause all the nutrients and the oxygen to leave the space, and then it can be so cold that it can actually freeze. Freshwater biomes are really affected by sewage and runoff, and here's one of those. And one of the reasons why you shouldn't use too many fertilizers in your yard is because that runs off and goes into the freshwater systems. And when there's too much runoff, then you can actually have algae blooms. So much algae grows that they will block sunlight, and then the photosynthetic plants can't survive, and they can actually choke off oxygen. There's actually a really interesting creature that lives in these types of places called rotifers, and rotifers actually have like a spinning almost mouth part that feeds on, you know, photosynthetic plants that are in there. But I just think they really look interesting when you look at them under a microscope. So I will see if I can bring up one of these that you can see it for just a minute, with a rotifer and a spinning mouth part, and how they feed. Okay, so look that up if you are interested. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about are rivers and streams. Rivers and streams have a source of where they're getting it. Sometimes that's snowpack or rain. And the source water is usually pretty cold. It usually doesn't have very many nutrients because it's fresh water. And it usually runs pretty clear. And then as it goes further and further down, it usually picks up more sediment and nutrients, and also tends to pick up you know, things like dead and decaying matter. And so as it moves down along the way, it'll tend to have more nutrients. And then there's animals that are very specifically adapted to live in the moving water. One of those are like leeches. Leeches actually have suckers on both ends of them so that they can hold on really tight to whatever they grab and keep themselves safe. In different bodies of fresh water, they will undergo something called turnover. This is a process that happens usually in the spring and fall, where it gets a lot cooler or a lot warmer really quickly, and the water will actually switch layers. So the cold water or the warmer water from down below will actually come up and the cooler water will go down. And that switching of water that happens, called turnover, actually rotates nutrients and really helps the bodies of water to stay where they have a lot of oxygen and nutrients throughout. Wetlands were once an area that were considered useless and that they needed to be dug out and create places that humans felt were useful, like boat docks or harbors. And it's really unfortunate because we lost a lot of our wetlands. Southern California specifically had wetlands all up and down the coast, and now we have very few. Some are being restored though now, which is really good. So wetlands are very productive ecosystems. There's been different data that's come out that's shown that wetlands filter out pollutants faster than any other ecosystem. So obviously that's extremely important to life right now, and that they support a huge number of species. So they naturally purify contaminants out of the soil and water, and they reduce erosion and help with flooding. One of the ways that they purify the water, and I want to show you this, is I got to go stay with the Mangala Aboriginal tribe in Australia, and they actually used their own money to purchase land back that had been bought many years ago, I think, from French farmers that were building sugarcane. So they had cleared the wetlands and built sugarcane. And then that had gone on for however long, a few hundred years. And then the Mangala Aborigine tribe, which is like their native people to Australia, they actually purchased this land back. And here's me standing here in their wetland. They actually purchased the land back and have slowly started rebuilding the wetlands by freeform digging areas out and by planting native species. And in a very short period of time, you can see the succession that they have where they started about probably 10 to 15 years ago at this point in time, and they have replanted sections, and you can see all these native birds and native saltwater crocodiles and native turtle and everything coming back to this space. And what's amazing is because they are on the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Barrier Reef that is near this Mangala station has actually experienced a lot more reef health and growth because this land is now filtering out the pollutants before it gets to the reef. So the work that these people are doing is very vital to the reef and helping it to be restored. So here in the United States, we need to think about those things and how we could help our own ocean ecosystems by restoring some of our wetlands and improving that health.